the Houston Philosophical Society at Rice University.
At the opening of the Rice Institute in 1912, now Rice University, its first president, Edgar Odell Lovett, made clear its obligation to spread new learning in literature, science, and arts to the citizens of Houston, not just its enrolled students. That goal was extended in January 1920 when several faculty members organized the Houston Philosophical Society to bring together monthly faculty and civic leaders in science, medicine, the law, and humanistic disciplines for dinners and for lectures on the newest developments in those fields and others.
Today, this organization continues to serve as a knowledge accelerator. It brings the latest ideas and discoveries to an intellectually curious membership through the form of popular and accessible lectures. Since 1927, the Society has met at the Cohen House Faculty Club on the Rice University campus, and it still reaches out to the broader Houston community and its various academic institutions for new members who are excited about sharing innovative ideas across the spectrum of professions and learned disciplines.
This town-gown society sought to engage both academic leaders and various civic leaders in exploring the world of ideas, the thought being that such interaction could enrich the lives of all participants. For over a century, these meetings have expanded friendships and broadened the perspectives of the members of the Houston Philosophical Society.
Good evening, everybody. Our little cocktail half hour has proven to be both pleasant and practical over the last few months. It gives everyone enough time to arrive in the Zoom room at their own pace, and it allows also for some very nice entertainment. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome one of the finest and most inspiring pianists of our time. Israeli-American pianist Tali Morgulis is a passionate performer and a dedicated pedagogue. Prize winner of several international competitions, Dr. Morgulis continues to present critically acclaimed solo performances, chamber music, and orchestral performances worldwide. Tali's recordings can be found on Delos, Albany, and Navona labels. Dr. Morgulis' students come from many different countries and from many different backgrounds. They describe her as a great motivator and an inspiring mentor. She takes pride in supporting not only their performance and teaching, but also in becoming important members of their respective communities. Tali began her college teaching career at Fort Hays State University in Kansas in 2005. She is currently an associate professor of piano at the Moore School of Music at the University of Houston. Tali started her music education in her native country, the Ukraine, at age 4. She continued studying piano after moving to Israel at age 15. Dr. Morgulis holds degrees in piano performance from the Tel Aviv Academy of Music, where she received her Bachelor of Music and Master of Music degrees, and the New England Conservatory in Boston, where she received her Master of Arts and the Doctor of Musical Arts. She holds diplomas from the Manhattan School of Music and the Conservatoire Royal de Bruxelles. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Tali Morgulis.
Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure it is for me to be part of this wonderful gathering. I've been to some of the Philosophical Society meetings as Sonia's partner previously, and it's really interesting for me to come back to you on Zoom now and have this wonderful interaction. Can you hear me okay? Is everything okay with the microphone and everything? Okay. So I'm here in my studio at the University of Houston, which I love, which has 2 huge windows and 2 pianos. And it's really my first performance, public performance out of my studio. So it's very interesting. I would like to tell you a little bit about the pieces I'm going to play. The first piece on today's program is 4 movements, selected movements from Schumann's piece entitled Forest Scenes. Forest and nature were very, very important subjects in romantic literature and art, visual art, and music, of course. It's interesting that Schumann had very tight literary connections. His father was a publisher, and he also had his own published magazine journal that he created. And so a lot of his miniature, they have beautiful titles to them. So the titles of the pieces that I'm going to perform for you today are, the first movement is going to be, and these are selections from the forest scenes. The first movement is a solitary flower. And the interesting fact about this set in this piece is that some of the selections, they have poetry attached to it. And sometimes the poetry is in stark contrast to what you're going to hear. So I actually really personally prefer it without the poetry, because I feel that the poetry is really sinister and the piece is absolutely gorgeous. So we'll leave the sinister part to some other kind of occasion. Today, I feel like we want to be positive. Second piece is called Hunter on the Lookout. So it's a more energetic, kind of urgent, very urgent piece. The third one is my absolute favorite, and it's called Bird Prophet. What a colorful, amazingly poetic title it is. And the piece is very, very unique, unlike any kind of other music you've heard. Really pretty special, very, very special. And the last movement, concluding this little cycle that I created, is actually the conclusion of the entire big cycle of 4 scenes, and it's just called Farewell. And it's a very positive farewell. It doesn't have some of the bitterness that other movements have in the cycle. It's really a pleasant kind of departure, sort of like Schumann being inspired and fulfilled by his connection to the nature and sort of returning to the real world and having that sort of uplifted kind of mood. So here are the 4 pieces from Forest Scenes by Robert Schumann. I just need to take 1 second to change my settings a little bit so you can hear me. So that you can hear me well. I need again one more second to make sure you're hearing me well. And just another word about the second piece on my program. That's a piece by Sergei Rachmaninov, a Russian composer, end of 19th century. The whole cycle of musical moments that I'm going to play for my faculty recital, which is coming up in a few weeks. The whole cycle consists of 6 pieces. Despite the title of the set, which is the musical moments, and that's all, unlike Schumann, Rachmaninoff doesn't go into literary details, descriptions, and stuff like that. This is a monumental piece. It's a half hour long, sort of a journey. I see in it a journey through a life. And there are some contemplative moments. There are some moments of extreme anxiety that you can hear in some of the movements. But the last moment that I'm going to play is pure joy and almost like ecstasy. It's in C major. It's very dense, like a lot of Rachmaninoff's pieces. That's why I like his music. It's very rich for the piano. You have all these colors, and he uses the entire instrument, and he really makes the pianist work hard, but get use all the resources that we have in our capacity to play the instrument, but also uses all the colors of our very rich instrument. So this is the last one from the musical moments. Just one really interesting detail about this piece is that this was written at the same time like his first symphony. This is one of the earliest piano works, Opus 16. So his symphony, he was writing the first symphony at the same time, and the symphony was not received well. And this period in his life was very, very difficult. And following the bad reception of his symphony, Rachmaninoff was depressed, very seriously depressed for 4 years. And at the conclusion of this 4 years, when he was finally recovering, the second piano concerto for piano and orchestra that a lot of you, I'm sure, heard and love, that piece was written 4 years after the musical moment. So what you hear is sort of like precedes the moments, but it was before a very bad, emotionally charged period that he went through. So this is number 6 from the musical moments.
Well, good evening. It's nice to see you all and Happy New Year. I hope that you're all doing well and that you're staying healthy. I'm sure that I can speak for most of us when I say I just can't wait to talk about things other than this global pandemic. But for now, it is one of the burning topics that consume our lives, unfortunately. Our speaker tonight emphasizes the importance of collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration to be specific. Those of you who are familiar with my academic work know that this is a subject that's very close to my heart. We can accomplish so much more together. Solving problems requires creativity, and creativity means that we take well-studied building blocks and we arrange them in a new order. Progress happens when we all collect our expertise and when we communicate. A term that I heard a little while ago that illustrates this beautifully is cognitive diversity. And in a way, it summarizes nicely what we all aim for in this particular society. We come together and we learn from each other. Our speaker tonight is an economist and economics professor, Loch-Temzelides. Ted is the George and Cynthia Mitchell Professor in Sustainable Development at the Department of Economics and a James A. Baker Institute for Public Policy Center for Energy Studies scholar at Rice University. He has taught and given keynote and research seminars at numerous universities and conferences around the world. He has worked and consulted for several institutions, including the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Central Bank of Portugal. His research interests include environmental inequality and global health, conservation and resilience, and non-standard mathematical modeling of decision-making. His current focus is in quantifying the economic and health consequences resulting from climate change, pollution, deforestation, and zoonotic pathogen transmission. He has been awarded numerous grants, including the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship and funding from the National Science Foundation. His work has been published in several leading journals, including the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, Conservation Letters, Econometrica, I hope I didn't butcher that, the Journal of Political Economy and Science. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Economic Theory. He is a CISIFO Fellow. He has served as a vice president of the board of directors of the French-American Chamber of Commerce, the Houston chapter. He has written opinions for the Wall Street Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Houston Chronicle, and Forbes. And he has appeared as a guest on Al Jazeera and on China Central Television. Ted enjoys tennis, nature walks, kayaking, and spending time in California, New York, and Nice. Ted, I must say, is one of the greatest conversationalists and one of the smartest and most gracious human beings I have the honor to call my friends. Please help me welcome Loch-Temzelides.
Before I start, I want to thank Sonia and the Society for the invite, the Rice media staff for making this presentation possible, and of course, all of you for being virtually here. It is nice to have the opportunity to escape the usual academic bubble and address this distinguished audience. And of course, I'm honored to give my very first, and hopefully not last, lecture to a philosophical society. The very name takes me back to my Greek education days, and I hope that my talk will be faithful to the Philosophical Society tradition and standards. The title of my talk is Ecology and Economics for Pandemic Prevention. Unfortunately, it's a very topical theme since we're in the middle of the pandemic right now, with no obvious way out in the short run. To say a few things about my work, I'm an economist by training. I'm a professor in the economics department at Rice and also affiliated with the Baker Institute. And I do mainly interdisciplinary work on the connections between economics, climate change, conservation, and issues related, more recently, issues related to global health. In today's talk, we'll mainly be talking about the costs and benefits of reducing the frequency of pandemic emergence. But towards the end of the talk, a second part of this talk will be a little bit about economic policies related to the pandemic. So the first part will concentrate on, in a sense, a cost-benefit analysis of what we can do in order to make pandemics less frequent events. We can't eliminate them completely. And the second part, we'll talk briefly about what to do, give some hints about what to do once the pandemic, despite our best efforts, is with us, and how to address that issue once it emerges. I will argue that the emergence of a disease like COVID-19 was indeed a matter of time, and so is the next pandemic for that matter. And I'll talk about what economics has to say about this, and you might perhaps find it surprising, but we'll see how economics can be helpful. The presentation today will be based on two recent research papers on mine. The first one, Ecology and Economics for Pandemic Prevention, appeared in Science a couple of months ago, and focused exclusively on COVID-19. The second one, which is currently under review, Investments in the Primary Prevention of Viral Zoonosis, studies pandemics over the last 70 years more generally and goes beyond COVID. The research in these papers was done by an interdisciplinary team. I won't be able to name, in the interest of time, I won't be able to name every single one of my colleagues. But there are two things I want to mention about this team. It was really a lot of fun working with a team involving so many people from so many disciplines. So the first is that pandemics, like many other challenges that we're facing, including global climate change, these are issues that cannot be addressed by one single discipline. Our team included medical doctors, virologists, disease biologists, ecologists, conservationists, and economists. We all had different angles to this question, and we all had something to contribute. The second thing I want to mention is that, as you can see from our affiliations, this is a team from people all around the world, and that's another thing I would like to mention this day, is that science, like many other human endeavors, is not restricted by boundaries. Now, a few things about the ecology and emerging pathogens. Of course, COVID-19 is defining our times in many ways, unfortunately, but it's not unique. In fact, wildlife is a hotbed of viruses. From time to time, they just make it through to human populations, and then we have these consequences that we see now. There are some aspects, some changes that have led to these pandemics becoming potentially more frequent. There's increased human-wildlife interface, and that's due to a number of reasons: agriculture intensification, deforestation, and habitat fragmentation, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a second, and also wildlife trade. Tend to make pandemics, the emergence of pandemics, somewhat more likely. Add to that the increased connectivity through aviation, where within a day, anybody from anywhere in the world can be anywhere else in the world. And we might be dealing with an increased pandemic frequency than what we've seen historically. What I have on this table, just for your reference, is some mortality numbers from zoonotic. These are diseases that have passed from animal populations to human, viruses that have passed from animal populations to humans. Of course, we all know about the Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic, killed over, it's hard to get exact numbers, but over 50 million people globally. But you can see here in chronological sequence several other episodes as well. So with a frequency of every couple of years, basically, we have something that kills several people. So one way of thinking about this is that there's a long sequence of near misses before we get to something more major. Some notable things here, of course, Spanish influenza, but also things like SARS and MERS, more recently related to COVID-19. And although not everybody is thinking about in these terms, HIV falls in this category as well. HIV AIDS was a virus that in terms of duration, it affected human population for decades as opposed to a few years, like influenza tends to do, or a few months. But nevertheless, as you can see, it was very deadly. COVID-19, you see there's a blank there. In terms of death, the Spanish influenza killed something in excess of 600,000 people in the United States. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we are now over 400,000. There's a projection that it will be about 500,000 people. And I think it is possible, I would say even likely, that depending on how vaccines are distributed, that we might actually reach the number, the 600,000 number, and make this the deadliest, deadlier than the Spanish influenza. Of course, one has to take into consideration that the United States has a much larger population now than it had 100 years ago. So this, the Spanish influenza was still, in relative terms, the most serious event. The next few slides are taken from a presentation that Dr. Susan Weiss gave to the National Academy of Medicine earlier this fall. And what I want you to witness here is a pattern. Starting with SARS, you might remember from 2002, starting with a bat finding its way to a mammal, affecting humans, and finally, the last step, a human-to-human transmission. It didn't last long, which is a good thing because the mortality was much higher than COVID at about 9.6%. Mainly affected China and Hong Kong. Moving on to MERS more recently in 2012, same family of viruses, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. Again, starting with a bat, affecting mainly camels, mainly in the Middle East, but also some incidents in Korea. Human-to-human transmission, mostly in the Arabian Peninsula. Camels remain a reservoir of MERS. Still new cases these days, although fewer, and a 35% mortality, so much more deadly. Moving on to SARS-CoV-2, which is the name of the virus that causes the disease, COVID-19. Most likely starting with a bat. The virus, virologists tell us, shares a lot of similarities with the viruses I mentioned before. It could be that a human was infected directly from a bat, but it is suspected that there was an immediate host, again, some kind of a mammal, possibly in the wildlife market in China. We did have, of course, human-to-human transmission, and the rest is history. Unfortunately, these numbers are outdated. They are as of October, and in fact, we've experienced a lot more deaths since. So it looks like we have identifying a guilty party. Let's get rid of the bats. That would be really a bad idea. Bats are incredibly well adapted and even useful creatures. So what we should be looking at is more what humans can do to avoid the interactions. These maps tell a story as well, and I want to go briefly over them. These are two figures related to Ebola, a different virus, but we're looking at Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. First of all, let's look at the colors. The darker green means a higher forest representation in the land. So red means next to nothing. So think of this as areas with plenty of humans. Light green and darker green, think of this as forest and deep forest, so fewer humans. And the yellow triangles in both maps stand for outbreak points between 2004 and 2014. So one thing you will notice is that outbreaks tend to happen in the point of interface between humans and wildlife. So when humans venture into wildlife, when we have wildlife fragmentation, this is where it's more likely for this virus to make the step and pass from wildlife to humans. In terms of prevention, as I said, we won't be able to eliminate the possibility of the next pandemic. The next virus that will affect humans is most likely already living in some bat somewhere. But we can do things to reduce the probability of emergence. What we did in our work is we did a cost-benefit analysis. We evaluated the costs of the pandemic, a pandemic, let's say, like COVID-19. And in fact, the way things have developed since, our costs are unfortunately a very low estimate of the actual costs that prevail. And we compare this with the costs that would reduce the probability of emergence. Now, of course, prevention measures, it's really hard to identify by exactly how much prevention measures will reduce the probability of emergence. But what we can do is to say by what degree this probability needs to be reduced so that we break even, so to speak. In that regard, we consider several scenarios. We conservatively assume that a disease of a pandemic of the severity of COVID-19 occurs once in 100 years. And we found that prevention measures would result in net benefits if they reduce this probability by 1/3. So the cost-benefit analysis is such that reducing the probability by 1/3 would be, in fact, more than enough in order to pay for these measures. Two things. First, as I already said, since the paper was written, the pandemic unfortunately has killed a lot more people and the economic costs have multiplied. That reduction in probability has reduced. In addition, this reduction can be significantly less if we take into consideration some co-benefits. For example, reducing deforestation does not only reduce the probability of a pandemic, but it also has climate change and climate-related benefits. So that if we consider those, actually, you should think of these estimates that I'm going to present to you today as being actually a low end or a low estimate. Now, I won't show you any equations. This is a graph that was prepared for The Guardian, a British newspaper that presented our findings at the time. And we divide. So what you see on the left, you should think of the size, the area of the square, as represented the $11.5 trillion that COVID has cost the global economy as of July, when this paper was written. As I said, unfortunately, these costs have been multiplying since. These costs come mainly from two sources. The first is lost GDP, gross national product or gross domestic product, the lost value of goods and services produced in the economy due to the slowdown associated with the disease. The second is the very cost of mortality. Economies have developed ways, and I'll talk a little bit about this next, of actually assigning a dollar value to human life and telling us translating losses in human life to a dollar value. So we're able to quantify that. This is something that's needed in order to evaluate policy, and there is a methodology that I'll sketch for you a little bit, give you an idea of how that works and how to do this. Now, this little square here, this little red square, corresponds to the 26.6 billion, which our estimations, our numbers tell us are the costs associated with what we would need in order to mitigate and make these pandemics less likely. Reduce the probability, in other words, by 1/3, the probability of emergence by 1/3, so that we break even. And as I said, this is a very, very conservative estimate. So you can see the difference in size between the two costs. If we take this little square and blow it up, and then it becomes the square in the right, and you can see we divided this into different parts to indicate what are the different components of this cost. The majority of this comes from the cost of eliminating about $20 billion of eliminated white meat trade in China. This is an active sector in the Chinese economy. It has been in the past, somewhat surprisingly, but it has been encouraged by government policy. Once something like this pandemic emerges, we do have some reduction in the activity in this sector, but this tends to be temporary and things come back. So eliminating, and this poses some challenges, I'll talk about this briefly in a second, but eliminate that sector will result in about $20 billion cost to the economy in China. The second biggest component in the mitigation costs is this 5.6 billion, which would be the estimated cost of reducing deforestation by about 40% in the regions that our analysis found to be the most critical in terms of pandemic emergence. So the way you should think of this cost is that if the forest stays put, well, it's not used for agricultural purposes, and as a result, income and economic activity is lost. So this is what we've estimated to be this $5.6 billion. A couple of things about that. One, we target it in ways that we get the most out of this investment. In other words, we target it by identifying the tropical forests that are more prone to infectious disease emergence, and therefore avoiding deforestation in those parts is something that would benefit us the most in terms of reducing the probability of emergence. The second thing is that, as I said, and we do some of these calculations in the paper, we can estimate the benefits that we'll be getting from this indirectly. Because tropical forests are sinks for carbon emissions, and they help somewhat with climate change. So if we are calculating these co-benefits, this cost actually reduces. The remaining components are costs related to avoiding disease spillovers, disease detection and control, monitoring, and so on. But what I want you to take from this is, again, this is a blown up little square, is that the annual costs of mitigation, of reducing the probability of pandemic emergence, are really dwarfed by the cost that an actual pandemic like COVID-19 creates. So let me talk a little bit about these two different costs. The direct loss to GDP, this is just something that I'm documenting here just for the third quarter of 2020, but this is something that has been with us to varying degrees in different countries, but all of them have been affected. You can see China already turning into the positive side, sort of the recovery beginning there. Numbers, GDP growth numbers from China, economists know to take them with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, China is returning, economic activity is returning there to not normal growth, but getting there. All other countries, including the United States, had suffered consequences. Lost GDP, of course, is just one way of capturing the cost associated with the pandemic. This reflects the value, the dollar value of goods and services that would have been produced and enjoyed by our population should the pandemic never have occurred. It does not capture things like the emotional cost of pandemics. It does not capture things like the cost, potential even mortality cost associated with lost, missed treatments and other medical situations that were affected, other medical conditions, including diagnostics and long-term care that have been affected by the pandemic. So again, once again, our numbers are, when it comes to the losses of the pandemic, are really an estimate that is on the low end of what the actual costs are. Let me say a little bit about the mortality costs and how economists deal with the mortality costs directly. These are effectively the costs associated directly with the loss in human life. And the relevant constant here is something called the VSL, or the value of statistical life. Now, of course, outside economists would like to put a dollar value to everything. It might sound a little bit like a sacrilege. Isn't the value of human life infinite? For economic purposes, no. And one, I would point you to a number of things that sort of demonstrate that we don't think in our daily life of the human life as having infinite value. We all make decisions that increase the probability of death by a little bit. This includes decisions related to just living our home, really, and driving, especially driving in Houston, but also flying. There are bonuses associated with taking a little bit of an extra risk in one's job. For example, if one is a deep sea diver, and this bonus and different wage associated with taking a more difficult and more dangerous task can again be used to show how humans evaluate these trade-offs of a small increased probability of death. The value of statistical life is really the monetary value of a small mortality risk reduction that would prevent what we call one statistical death. Another example, by the way, that economists use in order to evaluate this is there are several features, let's say when one buys a new automobile, that decrease the probability of having a fatal accident at a price. Think of this radar device, for example, that new cars have, sometimes as an extra, that can warn me if I'm trying to change lanes, let's say, and there's a car next to me and I could hit it at high speed, and therefore there's a potential of a fatal collision. A device that will eliminate or make very low a probability of such a collision is available to me at a cost. If I choose not to purchase that device at the cost where it's available to me, again, I'm making a statement about how I evaluate the probability and the cost of death as a result. But here's an example calculation of how the value of statistical life works. Imagine that we have a small society of 100,000 people, and we ask them on their willingness to pay in order to finance a project that will reduce the probability of death for each of them by 1 in 100,000. For example, you can think that each of these 100,000 people has to go through some dangerous intersection. Let's say the intersection between 59 and 610 in Houston, the notorious intersection, one of the most dangerous in the country, I'm told. Suppose we're talking about the cost of redesigning that intersection in a way that will lead to a reduction in this 100,000 people's risk of death, a deadly accident in that intersection by 1 in 100,000. Suppose that the average answer that we're getting is $100. So each of these 100,000 people is willing to pay $100 for a total of $10 million in order to raise the amount needed to redesign the intersection and result in the decreased probability of death in that intersection. Then a payment of $10 million results on average in saving one life. So the value of statistical life that an economist will infer from this example is in this society is exactly $10 million. Another way of saying this is that to save in expectation one life, in other words, reduce for each individual the probability of death by 1 in 100,000, and therefore, since we have 100,000 individuals, the probability, probabilistically, what we're saving is one life on the average. This society is willing to pay $10 million. So the value of statistical life will be 10 million. So this is just a hypothetical example. The actual numbers, and in fact, the value of statistical life is for technical reasons that we can discuss in our conversation session. It's also related to age. So you can see in 2000 value dollars, the value of statistical life is, for example, if you are in the category between 35 and 44 years old, it's about $10 million in today's dollars. So using these values and calculating the number of values lost multiplied by the respective values age adjusted, we were able to calculate the direct loss of life translated, the cost from direct loss of life translated to dollars, add this to the lost GDP, and then we get the total costs associated with COVID. These estimates are in the process of being updated. As I said, unfortunately, since July, when the paper was published, there have been a lot more deaths. Now, there are some challenges. I mentioned some ways of mitigating the probability of pandemic emergence. Economics is all about incentives. In fact, incentives is another name for our field. When it comes to banning wildlife, this has proved extremely difficult. Partly, there are some social norms that make this activity very desirable. This is associated with traditional medicine and with certain beliefs that are very hard to shake. One of the problems that might occur if this activity becomes brute force illegal is that the trade might turn underground. And if this underground trade emerges, it's even harder to monitor it. It can lead to further harm to biodiversity and, in fact, create more harm than good. It is best to regulate, educate people, and offer alternatives. But of course, this takes time, effort, and resources. Incidentally, developed countries are not, they also have to take a responsibility for wildlife trade. It is not just wildlife trade in China for food and traditional medicine, but a lot of fur and exotic pets, the United States being actually a major importer in the exotic pet trade. This fuels the wildlife trade, and this is something that we can all help to stop. The United States spends about $3.6 trillion annually on health, but devotes historically less than 3% of that to public health and prevention. In fact, this amount has been shrinking over the decades, over recent decades, and this is really something that needs to change. We need to do a better job. Coordination across countries is necessary, but also difficult. The World Health Organization has gotten some bad publicity recently, and actually largely for a good reason. They have been slow in responding and slow in identifying and slow in responding when it came to COVID. There's no question about that. There's need for reform in that organization. But either the World Health Organization or somebody else will need to play this coordinating role across countries. This is not something, both when it comes to prevention, when it comes to monitoring, and actually when it comes to solving the problem once a pandemic emerges. This is not something that any country, no matter how powerful, can deal with on its own. So coordination is a big thing, and this is something that needs to be addressed. The United States, as you know, has left the World Health Organization. Most, especially scientists, believe that we would be better served if we were part of it and have a role in how the organization should be reformed. And hopefully this is something that we're going to see with a new administration. But despite our best efforts, new pandemics will emerge. And we need a global, I emphasize, global plan to identify novel viruses in wildlife and livestock, test the capacity to infect human cells, raise the red flag when this happens. Much easier to control something that has emerged locally before it becomes a pandemic. But finally, if despite our best efforts, a pandemic emerges, responding early if all else fails is something that can help tremendously.
All right, and here is the moment of our famous intermission. We have to do that every time, and it's a great opportunity for us to, or for those of you who haven't met him, to meet the man behind the scenes, Aaron Aheitos. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Thank you.
So everyone, we're just going to take a quick break. The idea of the break is to is for everybody's benefit, really. We all have varying bandwidth internet connections at our homes, so the idea is to kind of slow things down a bit, allow our internet to catch up. That way, we don't see desync on the videos that we're presenting. So the idea is that the longer a video goes, the more sync audio to video issues you're gonna see. And doing this will kind of slow that down, normalize things, and allow everyone to the opportunity, to see a clean video. A lot of work has been done to get these videos ready, and it would be a shame for everyone not to benefit from the excellent work that was done. So yeah, this is why we do this. Fortunately, things are getting better. Zoom is making updates, and it's looking like this is probably not going to be as necessary as it was before. And that kind of brings me to just to remind everyone to make sure and update their Zoom client. Tablets and phones do this automatically, but computers, PC and Mac, they do not. So you want to make sure to, when you log in, you go to your little icon where it says your account, and you click the button where it says check for updates. This is really important because there's a lot of security updates. There are a lot of optimizations that have been done, and it really benefits everyone if you do this. Unfortunately, it's something that on PC and Mac that doesn't usually happen automatically. Sometimes it does if you have automatic updates, but some of us, like me, forget to do that. So you want to make sure and just give it a look. If you go to your account, it'll be on the upper right side of your application, and just click check for updates. Don't do it now because it will kick you from the Zoom meeting. But when you do this later, just click update, and you'll be good to go. All right, so I will.
Good. Well, thank you, Aaron. As you probably know, or most of you know, we pre-record the panels or talks just for safety in case a speaker is not available, and then you would all be in the Zoom room and there wouldn't be a speaker and one of you would have to step up. But we try to have enough live components. We do have the cocktail half-hour entertainment, which is live, and then of course we always have the speaker there after we play the recording to answer your questions. This recording in particular was made 2 days ago. So it's, we try to do it close enough to the meeting to just in case there are some current events that would affect the talk itself, but also just give us that little bit of security. Also, in our last executive committee meeting on Tuesday, our group voiced the desire to have some social exchange in our virtual meetings. And in other words, everybody is missing the real cocktail hour. So tonight we would like to invite you to stay in the Zoom room after the Q&A session. We will officially end the meeting like we always do. And if you feel like it, please just stay. Enjoy your dinner or a drink and catch up with your HPS friends. All right, and I guess now it's time for part 2 of Ted's talk, right, Aaron?
The second part of my presentation talks about what happens after a pandemic emerges. So this is something that I have less experience with scholarship on my own. I haven't researched the topic myself, but this is something that I've read a lot about, and this is something that I'm working on to some degree with colleagues right now. Once a pandemic emerges, the set of questions that arise are different. How and how fast will it spread? What policy restrictions can mitigate contagion? These restrictions may also harm the economy. Is there an economy versus health trade-off? This last bullet is an interesting question, actually, that has people who come from different points of view, like epidemiologists and economists, have different approaches to this issue. And this is something that I would like to share with you today, and how we the field and actually all of us would benefit from getting these views together in a coherent fashion. There are two views in that regard. The first that is mainly associated with epidemiologists, public health specialists, is that really there's no real trade-off. Any restrictions to mobility that bring down infections and deaths are also going to ultimately help the economy recover faster. Therefore, these restrictions, even if they are very strict, really they refer to a win-win situation. On the other side, the second view is that indeed there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is created by these restrictions of economic activity that do indeed reduce disease transmission, but at the same time, at least in the short run, they can be detrimental to economic activity and therefore harm well-being. Once one buys into the notion that indeed there is some kind of a trade-off, then to an economist, the obvious next question is, how can we explore this trade-off optimally? And I want to talk a little bit about this issue. First of all, how do we model pandemics once they emerge? So the modeling here has been mainly epidemiological, and the workhorse, I won't show you the equation. There's a 3 differential equation system. There are a lot of bells and whistles that can be added to it. In its simplest form, it's something called the SIR model. And S stands for susceptible, I stands for infected, and R stands for removed. So basically the population is divided into 3 categories. Susceptible, as the name suggests, are people who have not yet been infected, but could be infected through interacting in some way with infected people. Infected is self-explanatory, and models can distinguish between whether the infected people are symptomatic or asymptomatic. And finally, removed can refer to different things. It could be that some of the infected people recover. So R can stand for recover, and they can re-enter the economy. It could be that some of the people are unfortunately do not survive, and therefore they are removed because they pass away. And the SIR model describes the flows from one group to the other. So, for example, given the rate at which susceptible individuals get infected, given the rates at which infected people either recover or die, one can run simulations, and epidemiologists run a lot of simulations that show us how the pandemic spreads and how it might be mitigated if certain measures take place. For example, if we restrict mobility, what if we restrict mobility of certain groups versus others, and so on. Now, as I said, I won't show you any equations, and I won't show you any other simulations of the SIR model either. But I do want to give you a reference. So my favorite YouTube channel is something called 3 Blue, 1 Brown. This is a wonderful channel that does all kinds of things in mathematics in a very visual way. But one particular simulation, and I have the link here, it looks at simulating an epidemic or a pandemic. And the idea is, as I said, the way if you visit, and I encourage you to go and play, and there are, by the way, many other things online that are free, where you can go and parameterize an SIR model and run it and see how these pandemics might spread, stop, and so on, and how they respond to policy. But basically, you will see things like that. So I hope you can see this. So the little blue dots, for example, here stand for people who are susceptible but are not infected. You can think of the red dots are standing for infected people. These dots move around at some random fashion. This is meant to simulate economic or other social activities. And once you come into contact with an infected person, with some probability you get infected yourself. And then you can see how the fraction of susceptible versus infected versus recovered and so on, people changes over time. For example, you could put a barrier here to restrict the mobility. And as a result, there's the rate of infection reduces. You can study and simulate super spreader events, people who have many connections and therefore can infect many people, and so on and so forth. So this is the workhorse of epidemiologists. One limitation of this model for economists is that it doesn't consider incentives. People are not particles, and they don't randomly bump into other people. People make choices. And they make choices to best meet their own incentives and needs. They might pursue certain interactions because that's beneficial to them. They might avoid others. They might choose to change behavior. For example, they might choose to avoid restaurants or other related places where they might get infected, even if there's no regulation in place that prevents them from doing so. They might change their behavior as a result of regulation, sometimes in ways that are unpredictable and that the regulation didn't foresee. They might bypass rules. Unfortunately, they might even ignore rules altogether. So there is a need for taking, and this is a methodological point, but I want to bring it up. There's a need for taking these epidemiological models and combining them with models of individual decision-making, like the ones that the economists are used to employ in their research. Indeed, this field has blossomed recently during the pandemic. There are literally thousands of papers that have been written in the field that is called epi-econ modeling, that combines epidemiological models with economic incentives. These are used to better evaluate trade-offs faced by individuals in the economy and to give more robust and more useful, I would say, policy advice. I will not show you the equations of these models. For those who are interested, I'm happy to provide references. This involves some kind of epidemiological matching and together with some optimal control problems of individual decision making when it comes to economics. I will mention the main findings of this model. The first is that indeed there is a trade-off. So stricter policies related, for example, to lockdowns that reduce and are designed to reduce contagion and deaths also harm economic activity in measurable ways. The best way to see this is diagrammatically is that there's some kind of a frontier. So if we think of the two objectives, let's say objective one as being minimize deaths, and objective two as being minimize the negative effects to the economy. There's some frontier that we can't get beyond that, and not having to, if we want to reduce deaths even further beyond that frontier point, this can only happen at the cost of some measures that would be costly to the economy, and the other way around. For example, if you consider the extreme here of a point that the policy that, let's say, will minimize contagion and deaths to the maximum possible degree, that would be a policy of a curfew where everybody has to stay home. This would be the one, for example, it's a policy that is feasible. We can do that. Economically, this will involve some costs that will be really, the economy will simply collapse. But when it comes to death, that's the way to have and contagion of the disease, that's the way to have the minimum amount. And there is a frontier of these points. Now, neither the economists nor the epidemiologists are the ones who should be choosing which point in that frontier the society wants to choose. In democratic societies, the people ought to choose whether we want to tolerate more risk of transmission of disease in order to harm the economy less, or the other way around. Points outside the frontier are not feasible, so economists and epidemiologists are able to document this. And once we identify the frontier, we also are able to choose policies that will eliminate points that, like this blue point here, that are clearly inefficient. So the role of the economists, the epidemiologists, and the other specialists is to make sure that the policies are cleverly designed so that we could not move to the, northeast. In other words, we cannot get to a situation where we meet both objectives in a better way. But once the frontier is reached, the society needs to choose how much risk is going to tolerate in order, risk of transmission of disease and deaths is going to tolerate in order to harm the economy less. And it could very well be that different societies, different economies, different countries, or even states might take a different view on this. So I like this diagram, and I wanted to bring it forward in a somewhat provocative way, perhaps, but I want to demonstrate what the specialists, what the technocrats can do and what they cannot do. They can identify trade-offs, they can tell us what's not feasible, and they can tell us what is inefficient, the interior of this frontier set, what is often called the Pareto frontier. So they can identify policies that can bring us to different points on the frontier, and all these policies are efficient, but it's not up to the technocrats to choose among efficient points which one should be chosen. A second example I want to point as an example of optimal policy and something that captures this health economy trade-off is an example of an actual policy that was actually implemented in connection to restaurants in the United Kingdom. Here I will present what I will call the epidemiology or public health perspective or prescription. What some people call the economic, but as you can see, I have it here in quotes because this was not the economist's prescription, but it was, in a sense, it was the politician's prescription, and it was the one which was implemented. It was motivated on the basis of economics, but it was different from what the economists were prescribing, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Economists' prescriptions are very frequently ignored by politicians, and this is one example. And finally, I will talk about what was actually the economist prescription at the time, the one that actually explores the optimal trade-off. Restaurants and, of course, the hospitality business were very severely affected during the pandemic. This was true in all countries. And here's just one example. This is reservations using OpenTable, but really there are many other statistics out there that document this. And this is the change over a year earlier during the same season, because there are seasonal effects. This is just for March. And you can see I put some sample countries here: Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, but also the global, if you can see the orange curve. And really, it was like devastating, obviously, for this business. So you can think of different policies for addressing the trade-off. Again, the trade-off is restaurants are places that get crowded. People get together in close proximity. These are places where people can easily get infected. And therefore, you could think that from the public health point of view, they're better avoided. From the economics point of view, we have a multi-billion-dollar industry which a lot of people rely on for employment. And if that industry is completely devastated, we have several people whose incomes and so on are devastated as well. So what do we do? That's the trade-off. The public health perspective was more or less that the lockdown to avoid infections in such closed and crowded spaces should be our first priority. But the problem with that is that the resulting restaurant and economic losses were perceived as unacceptable. So what emerged in the United Kingdom at the time, this was about August, is what the politician calls the economic prescription. They created a program that they called Eat Out to Help Out. So kind of like in direct contrast to what public health officials were prescribing at the time, they did exactly the opposite. You can see here the very photogenic Treasury Secretary of the United Kingdom saying that he loves to stimulate the economy. So what they actually did is they provided vouchers to encourage, not discourage, but encourage restaurant going. The idea was that people might actually be scared that they might get infected. So they need to be induced, in fact, to go to restaurants in order to assist this business. They offer 50% discounts. This amounted to up to $10 per person for people who ate out on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. These were days where the crowds were lower than otherwise. The Treasury ended up spending over 500 million pounds on subsidizing over 100 million meals during that process. So again, contrary to public health officials' advice about doing the exact opposite, the government took the quote-unquote economic prescription view that this industry needs to be stimulated. And since people are skeptical about going out, actually what we need to do is to help them go out more by giving them these financial incentives. This policy proved disastrous. The British Treasury hasn't yet admitted to that, but there are several papers that document that it led to elevated levels of infections, directly led to several deaths. And almost equally importantly, it led to further lockdowns at additional economic costs that perhaps could have been avoided. As I said, this was termed the economic solution, taken with economic considerations in mind. But actually, the economists were, I don't know if they were screaming, but they were certainly saying, no, don't do this. What does the economist prescribe for this situation? Again, let me refocus the dilemma. we have jobs and income and potential economic devastation of having restaurants being closed. And I'm using restaurants here and the eat out to help out policy, but I'm sure many of you are aware of or familiar with and have heard of related policies and related concerns and trade-offs in other sectors. That's the one concern, the economic concern. The other concern is the health concern, that this business creates an externality in the sense of having increased probability of infection in crowded spaces. So here's the economist's prescription. Economists say, no, don't subsidize, do the exact opposite. Tax restaurant goers. Make restaurant going more expensive, not less. If you make a good, including restaurant meals, more expensive, fewer people are going to go to restaurants. As a result, the spaces are going to be less crowded, and restaurants will be able to apply measures that will bring somewhat more spacing, somewhat more isolation. So contagion will be more difficult. So we are taking an environment where restaurants operate barely because fewer people go there. And those people who go there, they actually have to pay a hefty price because in addition to the regular meal price, they pay an additional tax. But it does result in greater distancing and fewer infections. Then take these revenues from the tax and redistribute them to restaurant owners. This additional revenue will help them stay in business and compensate them, perhaps partially, but compensate them for the amount of money that they lose from the lost business, from people not going there either because they're scared or, of course, because meals now suddenly became way more expensive. This economist prescription was not implemented. You can probably guess why. Because it has this dirty word tax in it. It's very hard to for Treasury to apply a policy that has the word tax in the middle of a pandemic. It is something that will optimally balance the trade-off between getting fewer people in the restaurants and therefore have them to be more distance, and get the money needed in the hands of the restaurant owners who desperately need this extra cash in order to stay in business. Of course, you might argue, wait a minute, that's also not fair. You're taxing people. So what this means is that, especially if the tax is non-negligible, those people who will be able to go to the restaurant at the end of the day are those who will be able to afford it. So wealthier people are able to go out and eat because they can afford to pay this tax. Less wealthy people maybe less so, and this is definitely true. But again, this is not about comparing some ideal state to what we're facing. Given the challenges that we're facing, this is the optimal solution. It does have this feature that. It makes it's a less painful policy for wealthier individuals who can afford to pay the tax than others, but it's a policy that will accomplish the optimal balancing of this trade-off between having fewer people at the restaurant at any given time and having the cash going in the restaurant owners. By the way, those of us who work on climate change and the economics of climate change have a similar experience when it comes to carbon taxes. This is beyond the scope, of course, of this presentation, but let me just say one sentence that virtually all economists agree that the best way of dealing with climate change is to internalize the externality associated with carbon emissions. The best way of doing this is through a carbon tax. Then once this externality is internalized and once the polluting technologies, the carbon emitting technologies are subject to that task, then the field is even, and then many technologies can compete on an equal footing. Once again, the dirty word carbon tax makes this politically very difficult to implement. Some countries are moving in that direction. Some states in the US are moving in that direction, and with a new administration, we will possibly see some policy moving in that direction as well. But this is a different topic. This brings me to my conclusion. A couple of bullets to take away. This pandemic has been yet another realization of how globally interconnected we are. No country, not even island countries, are isolated islands when it comes to the pandemic. Very much like climate change, and thus this is one of the reasons that I brought this challenge up. Pandemics are global problems that can only be solved through global coordination and through global solutions. They need global solutions. To that, in that regard, again, the change in administration and somewhat more outward-looking and cooperative view of global policies is something that many other countries will welcome, and I think that will prove beneficial. The cost of preventing, and by preventing, I should emphasize, we don't mean that there will be 100% prevention, but rather that pandemics will become less frequent events. This cost is well worth the investment. In fact, anything that happened between the time that we published on paper in July up to now, and unfortunately, we are months from getting out of this pandemic altogether. Everything has proved that the cost of the pandemic by far outweigh the cost of mitigation, of making these pandemics less probable, of monitoring and sounding the alarm once a pandemic occurs. Coordinated global monitoring and research is the best way to prepare, and coordinated action is the best way to respond to this global challenge. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wow, the dirty word. Thank you, Ted. And Ted, you are here, right? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we will now open the floor for your questions. Thank you.
As we're waiting, let me just, oops, sorry, just dropped my mouse. You still hear me, right?
We do.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here and patiently listening. I've been watching everybody listening to this. Really appreciate it. And as we're waiting, I just noticed that there were a couple of questions in the chat. So if I may, is that okay, Sonia, if I respond to those?
Oh yeah, this is your show, Ted.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. So the first one was about VSL, the value of statistical life, and I kind of expected this would be controversial, somewhat, a little bit, maybe. Non-economists are usually surprised by the economist's ability to ruin everything, including assigning dollars to human life. But when decisions need to be made that sometimes will affect numbers of life in expectation, and public projects, for example, when it comes to safety in highways and things like that, need to make these calculations. So we need to have a notion of what is the value to the society of what we call the statistical life. In response to the question that you can probably see in the chat, whether, for example, if you have two hospitals, one more effective than the other, and let's say some people are, statistically more people die from the same conditions in the less effective hospital, let's say, than the other. This actually doesn't affect the calculation, because the value of statistical life is the answer to the following question. How many resources, how many dollars is the society willing to put in place to, in expectation, save one statistical life? And I think the intersection between 59 South and 610 here in Houston, where I almost lost my life, so it's in an accident, so it's something I'll never forget. This is one example, right? This is one case where by putting the right amount of dollars there and redesigning that that intersection in a safer way, in expectation, certain lives will be lost. So to an economist, the fact that we are not doing that, looking at statistically how many people are killed in that intersection every year, and unfortunately there are dozens, the fact that we are not going ahead and repairing that and paying the cost that's needed in order to redesign that, we're making a statement about actually how we value these dollars saved versus these lives lost. So another way of saying this is, what is the cost to society somehow when it comes to all this? Unfortunately, my prediction is that we're going to lose more people from COVID than we did from the Spanish flu 100 years ago. Of course, as I said, when I presented these numbers, the population of the US is, of course, much larger now. So the Spanish flu was a much bigger event. But even the current prediction is they don't have to be pessimistic. Those that are sort of right middle of the road are for 500,000 deaths. So if I want to say, what does this mean in terms of actual costs and compare it with other costs, like the cost of lost GDP and so on, I need to translate these deaths somehow into dollars. So the answer, the $10 million is the answer to the question, how many dollars do we lose from each person who passes away on the average from COVID? So it's not affected by effectiveness of treatment or anything like that. Another place, by the way, where calculations like this are used is in actuarial science, when people calculate, insurance premiums and so on. This is also a place where probabilities of death enter. It's a complicated calculation, and as you saw, it's adjusted by age, and it can also it's adjusted by country as well. The second question that I see here is actually a little easier to answer, and yes, I confirm that the United States has re-entered the World Health Organization. It's exactly right. It happened, I believe, either shortly before we recorded that presentation or shortly after. I don't know exactly when it was announced. But yes, this is together with re-entering the Paris Agreement. This is wonderful news. It's good for the rest of the world to see American leadership, and it's good for America to join and lead the rest of the world. When it comes to the World Health Organization in particular, I hope I argued convincingly, because this was one of my main points, that pandemics are really not things that any country alone can address. It's something that needs coordination across countries, both in terms of prevention, in terms of monitoring, but also in terms of dealing with a situation once a pandemic emerges. The World Health Organization is the leading coordinating authority, a UN authority, when it comes to this issues related to pandemics and more generally global health. It's far from perfect, and it's in desperate need for reform, and it's much better for the world, including the United States, to have the United States being part of that reform. Being part of shaping that reform, as opposed to watching others doing it from the outside. So yes, rejoined the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement, and I couldn't be happier about both. So that's what I see in the chat. I don't know if I missed anything.
There's another question. To what extent have the units of the UN over the years considered and then actually deployed economists' formulae in setting public health or other multilateral challenges?
Yeah, so there is economics input, and the UN is one of these organizations that uses inputs from several disciplines. This is not only true of the UN, but also of other organizations that are affiliated. I do some work currently for the World Bank, which is also a UN-related organization, in connection to evaluation of ecosystem services. This is a different kind of issue, but it is not unrelated. When we value goods and services, there are a lot of services that come from ecosystems, including new medications that are potentially discovered, including issues that these are carbon sinks and therefore they assist with climate change. And there are many issues there that involve, I mentioned ecosystems because it involves not only economics expertise and formulas, but also ecologists and actually other social scientists as well, including anthropologists, sociologists, and so on. One of the things that economists contribute is, and this is one of our main tools in our field, is this cost-benefit analysis. It's very uncommon that you have one solution that dominates, that is clearly the right one. And if such a solution exists, you don't need an economist. What the economist comes in is when two things are in place. The first is that there are multiple objectives that require some kind of a trade-off. And I the one that I mentioned in this example, I want to in this lecture, I want to come back to for a second. And the trade-off is economic activity, which suffers a lot from closures and shutdowns and having people stay at home and so on, versus deaths, infections, and deaths. So that is a trade-off. And the job of the economist is to do the cost-benefit analysis to quantify that trade-off, and then to say, look, policy X will bring you in this point in the frontier where you have this many deaths in expectations and this many economic losses. A different policy, a stricter policy, might lead to fewer deaths, but there are costs associated with economic closures. For example, there have been well-documented incidents of people not getting treatments because they don't leave their home, right? Or they can't leave their home during a pandemic. This might include diagnostics that in expectation will catch, some disease that might save somebody's life. There is increased documentation that mental health issues are another major cause of having people, stay at home. So there are trade-offs, and economists try to assign dollar values to these trade-offs. And our role is not to actually make the call, but it's to inform policy so that they, in a democracy, it's the people through the representatives that actually will decide what we do. The role of the technocrats is to make that decision as informed as possible. The second place where economics, I think, is very useful, this goes a little bit beyond the question, but I do want to mention this, is when it comes to incentives. And this really, for us economists, this is a holy word. And that's something sometimes people ask, working with ecologists and natural scientists, and many of you are in those fields, what is the main difference? And this is I guess one way of saying this is that economists are very cynical people. My ecologist friends tend to think that if there is the right thing to do, that people are going to go ahead and do the right thing. And if they don't do it, if you go and repeat to them and say, look, this is the right thing, then they're actually going to see the light and they're going to do it. Economists are very cynical. They tend to think that people actually do the things that are to their best interests. And if you want them to do the right thing, whatever that is, you have to design the rules in such a way that it's to their best interest to do the right thing. So anyway, that's another way where economics helps, I think, with this. And this, when we talk about it, we describe it in words, but actually these incentives can be described also in equations, and there are a variety of ways that this enters the picture. Just to give you one example, conservation strategies. In many cases, conservationists will step in a situation where there are some endangered species in the area, and they will hope that the local communities will just cease economic activity that might harm these species. The truth of the matter is that even if these things are poaching, for example, if they're forbidden, in order to preserve the species and in order to promote conservation, somehow income will have to be provided for the local communities. And unless we find some alternative sources to provide income for these people, this could be ecotourism, or it could be, and this is again where economists and ecologists, I think, can work very effectively together. It could be ecotourism, it could be other sources of income. Some NGOs might step in and help. But unless these alternative sources are provided, people will have to make a living. And if you make it illegal for wildlife to be harmed, like with wildlife trade, it will just, happen underground. And if things happen underground, that's actually a double loss, because not only nature is harmed, but it's harmed in ways that we can't monitor, and we can't really have a saying, because the activity just turns illegal. So that's another aspect where I think economics can be useful in recognizing, accommodating, and designing policies that take incentives into account. Anyway, sorry, a long answer to the question.
We have another question in the chat.
Yep. Oh, let's see.
Houston Heyman. It says, based on economic evaluations.
Okay, yeah.
You see it?
I see it. Based on let me read it. Based on an economic evaluation, do you have a number in mind that should have been our country's target deaths for the pandemic up to now? No, is the short answer. This is not something that this is an excellent question, but there isn't really a number that I can identify and say that number should have been X, and the number is Y, and therefore Y minus X, the difference between the deaths that we've observed and those that we should have expected, can be considered a measure of the failure. If I understand this question correctly, this is one way of thinking about what is the measure of the failure of current policies, right? Given what we are witnessing right now versus what should have been. One thing that I will say is that when I look at Europe, for example, and one of the things that bothers me about what I've seen so far in the U.S. is the lack of coordinated federal response. This is something that really in a pandemic situation, this is not. You can't have state solutions or city solutions. It's people move and that's it. So the solution has to be, at the very least, the policies have to be at the federal level, and of course you have to accommodate somehow what comes from overseas. But then again, when I look at European deaths and incidents, and when I look at European countries like Germany and France and so on, which we consider, or the UK, as being similar in many ways, you see that actually Europe looks a little better. But if you look a little bit more closely, you will see that this is because of, and this might make Sonia feel good, this is because Germany actually looks very good. So somehow Germany did a better job. So if I look at, France had a big coordinated, what we would call federal national response. In some ways, the UK as well, they made some mistakes. But again, when I look at how they look, they actually look a little bit worse, some of these countries, than the US. Germany, admittedly, did a better job. So I can't tell you that, other countries that are have similar healthcare, are in a similar advanced level of healthcare, although healthcare in the US is unique in many ways. Or same level of economic resources, pretty much, and I can't say that the U.S. is doing very badly compared to the deaths that we should have seen. Obviously, what happens with the vaccine from now on, and this was not something that has been part of our research so far. But the way we're going to see the vaccine moving along, that will be a major factor in what follows, and I think that's So the success on that front remains to be seen.
Are you taking questions from the audience?
I'm happy to. Yeah, absolutely. Please, please go ahead.
Yeah. First, I want to say that you have made a most wonderful presentation in many dimensions, and thank you very much. The present administration, do you happen to know whether it has engaged economists and epidemiologists? Has it done so far? Does it plan to, or do you know?
Yes. First of all, thanks for your kind words. I really appreciate it. And yes, they have. And I don't know if you today, Anthony Fauci, the physician, has been on TV, and you can find many videos of him speaking about. I have to be careful how to phrase it, but speaking a little bit about the difference in the atmosphere and the different way that he, as a scientist, views his role, how comfortable he feels in being out there in the public, expressing his views. I'm much more confident that what we'll see in the future from this administration will be guided from science. And that it will be guided, yes, there will be economic expertise as well, and there are some signs that this expertise is already there, and they're already working on the problem.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just answering questions in the chat. Alan is asking, what do you think the U.S. should do right now?
This is a question for me, right?
This is a question for you, yes.
Yeah. Thanks for putting me on the spot.
You can punt on it if you want.
Yeah. Let me go back to something that I said earlier. I forget which was there was a US president that was looking for a one-handed economist because the economists were always saying, oh, okay. Because the economists would say on the one hand, but then on the other hand, so there was never a straightforward answer. So I want to emphasize something that I said before, that which I think it's an important point, which is that there are multiple objectives here. There is the economy, there is health and minimizing deaths. And these two objectives are not necessarily going in the same direction. So really, it's not, while it's the role of the economists to identify the trade-offs and help the policymakers make sort of the most informed decisions, it is not the role of the economists to actually, tell us what we should do, right? So hopefully the presentation was informative in identify the trade-off. So what I feel somehow more that I can say something more informed is not so much about what we should do, but rather where the epi-econ modeling and so on tell us their priorities should be, And I think that really vaccination is an incredibly important. Getting these vaccines into the arms of people as early as possible. This is going to be incredibly important. So that's where I think the emphasis should be. So it should be on somehow getting the numbers of the vaccines that are available out there, but making sure at the same time that we don't have these coordination failures where the vaccines are there, but people are not getting them. In that regard, I want to say two things. The first is that there's some anecdotal evidence that, as you know, some of the vaccines, in particular the Moderna and the Pfizer, have the feature that because of the ultra cool temperatures that are needed, there's a really, there's an expiration to those. So once they are taken out of these ultra cool temperatures, they need to be used. So, there's some anecdotal evidence that this comes out of the boxes, it needs to be used, and somehow due to coordination, organization failures, they can't find the arms to put them in. So either there have been some incidents where they actually had to be disposed of. Fortunately, I think there were limited incidents, but there were some, and there were some incidents where basically they would just announce, yeah, you might not be in the category that is vaccinated right now, but we don't want to throw them away. So whoever is here, would you like to get the vaccine? So that's not the way to do this. I mean, we have to be more organized, and that's the first thing. The second thing, which is related. It's something that, quite frankly, I find shocking, and many of you might have more insight on this than I do, which is the sort of the skepticism of people, even educated people. In fact, even people who are in the health business, people who are nurses and crews, not so many physicians. Skepticism in actually taking the vaccine. There are many, there are some numbers that say that in some cases, this can be close to 20, 30% of, and we're talking about health professionals who should know better. So this is an issue where there is a failure in education. Again, to those who might think that Europe is in a better place, France is one of the countries, Western countries, that is actually leading the world when it comes to vaccine skepticism. So this is not an American phenomenon. It's not a US phenomenon. I think it's less prevalent in Canada, but certainly this vaccine skepticism and the fear that, where the vaccines, are the vaccines safe, where they develop properly, all the way to conspiracy theories about, Bill Gates putting stuff in vaccines so that they monitor my movements. But this is something that somehow, and this is not going to happen, within a day or two. But I see it as a failure of education, and we have to do better on that front as well. If the vaccines are there, but a significant number of people refuse to take them, this is going to be detrimental in terms of reaching the herd immunity that we need to reach in order for this to be effective. In that regard, there's some additional worrying evidence. There's a new version of the virus, a new strain of the virus. One of them was seen in the UK. I think it's understood, and there has been at least one study by Pfizer, that the current vaccines are going to be effective when it comes to that new strain. But there is a new one, I believe, coming out of South Africa, and there actually it's, I think, significant. Some of you guys might be physicians, might know more about this, but I heard some more concerns from my colleagues about that particular one. So one scenario is that we are going to be facing not just one, but actually a possibly yearly reappearance of a COVID-like virus, like COVID-19, that would be sufficiently different from the previous year to be very much like the flu in terms of its reaction to existing vaccines. In other words, we might need a new vaccine, which might be just a variant of the existing one, but we might need a new vaccine every year. And again, this might be like flu-like in the sense of mutating, but it's not flu-like in terms of its mortality. It is well documented now that its mortality is higher than.
No, she's told me I'll be the last person to ask the question.
Oh, sorry. Just to complete the sentence. So, getting the vaccines in people's arms and getting people to actually, follow the science, get the education that's needed to actually accept the vaccines. I think that's really the number one critical factor for our success.
Thank you. So one more question before we wrap this up. Gail had a question that was partially answered by our in-house epidemiologist, Wayne Shandera, who has been very active on the chat. So I think we should.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my video isn't working. I've been having some computer issues. I would like to ask, I don't think it's very useful in the limited time we have left to have a debate about whether this particular COVID had anything to do with a laboratory accident or not. There are people who ask the question, but given the fact that more and more countries are engaging in biological weapons development, don't you think it would be useful to have the possibility of laboratory accidents taken into account and dealt with in some way in your models and thinking? And thank you for letting me ask the question. And I'm asking that of the speaker tonight.
Thanks. Thanks for your question. So first of all, this is obviously not an economics question, other than the last part, which is, should this possibility be in economic modeling as well? Again, there are medical practitioners in the audience, sounds like that are more qualified. What I can communicate to you is the answer that I got from my virologists, physicians, and we had some people in our team actually that who are really specialized in these SARS-like viruses. The biology of the virus, and again, I'm an economist, so I won't be able to elaborate on this. But what the virologists tell me is that the biology of the virus is such that, scientists are not going to rule out 100% anything, right? So they're not going to tell you, no, it's impossible that it came from a lab. But I think they classified by looking at the virus, by looking at similar viruses that had a particular path from the bats to mammals to humans in the past, they consider this event to be extremely unlikely. They consider the event of this being a virus that was developed in human. In fact, what they told me explicitly is that this technology of creating such a virus in a lab does not exist.
Sir, but my question was putting aside this particular virus. Isn't that a possibility given the number of labs in different countries working on biological weapons? And I'm puzzled as to why your models and discussions don't take into account that another pandemic could be caused by a laboratory accident.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So that's. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I concentrated on this. I thought you were asking about this virus. So yes, so when we are looking at viruses, we are considering our analysis is restricted to what is termed zoonotic diseases. So these are diseases that pass from wildlife to humans in some way. You're absolutely right. There are labs out there that are producing bio weapons, and it is possible that one day one of those will escape and might create actually problems in some significant scale. To my knowledge, this hasn't happened, and to my knowledge, this hasn't been studied. So you're raising a good point. This is something that should be investigated. It's hard to evaluate. When we look at probabilities of things, it's we look at things that happen in the past, and that's partly why I showed you this this long list of viruses that we've studied, zoonotic diseases, just to indicate that COVID is not an isolated event and that we have something with a frequency of once every couple of years. We use these frequencies and severities of things that happened in the past in order to calibrate the probability that things like that and of what severity they will likely occur in the future. For something like biochemical weapons escaping a lab, there isn't really this statistical sort of background to inform my projections for the future. But this doesn't mean that we could not study, or that we should not study scenarios about possibly how likely this is, although I can't readily see how I would be able to calibrate that probability, but also what it would imply, right? So, consider certain scenarios of bioweapons, certain toxicity, or causing certain amount of deaths. What is the probability of this happening, and how we can possibly address it? I don't think this has been studied, so you're raising an interesting point.
Well, thank you so much, Ted, for this very enlightening talk, and certainly very enlightening Q&A session. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here tonight. Please mark your calendars for an energy panel on February 18th, moderated by Judge Ed Emmett. Again, I think he was a previous guest of the Houston Philosophical Society. And if you're leaving now, have a good night. And for those who would like to stay a little, I am turning over the microphone to Justice Kais, David Furlow, and Alan Lavander to lead some more conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sonia, and thanks everybody. It was an honor.
An honor on our side, Ted. Thank you.
Tremendous honor. And tremendous honor, and is to us that he would talk to us. And it raises an awful lot of very interesting questions. So I don't know what questions people haven't answered yet, but I hope people will come forward, because I've got a question of my own and I don't want to go first.
I wonder if Wayne would stay, because he probably, our in-house epidemiologist, he would probably have some interesting things to say.
Thank you, Ted. That was an excellent program. It really gave us an opportunity to see the balancing between competing goals and the way one quantifies human life in ways that really do respond to the interest of people in the Houston Philosophical Society. So thank you for your time putting that together.
Maybe I can ask my question here.
Really appreciate it. Sorry, I was muted. I thank you.
Well, here's my question. What factors should we be looking at? I hear all the time, follow the science and value the lives that are lost and all that sort of thing. But now let's consider, and then I hear, consider the economic cost. What I worry about is that to me, a lot of the real problems in how to deal with this are occurring at the level of the policymakers. And they're occurring at that level because the actual material factors are not considered at all. What is really considered is politically scoring points against your opponent. And I think that is terrible, because to me, just take, for example, the shutdown of restaurants. I think it's a nice, pretty simple one. Everybody's worried about it. It seems to me that there are a lot of factors that need to be considered that are material to it, to that decision, in better and worse practices. What happens if you keep the restaurants open, but you only let people eat outside? What's the actual difference there? What's the evidence there? What's the evidence of what happens if you shut them completely down, not just economically, but on deaths and illnesses. Surely we have this evidence that of the material factors that lead to a common sense, good old American common sense political solution. And maybe since we've had this handled in 50 different states, we have a good example of lots of pilot programs to test out and see what happens. How, I don't know how economists look at this, but it seems to me the economists, the policymakers, the scientists really all need to have a voice that's heard here, and not just let the policymakers go off hog wild and their friends in the media and gin up a lot of stuff that's not really based on all the material facts. So, Professor Locke.
Thank you very much. This is an excellent question. Boy, where do I start? Well, let me put it this way. It's and this is the Philosophical Society. So this is I think a good way to start. Democracy is imperfect. It would be one system, and I'm not advocating for that system, would be to have the technocrats make the decision, like you're saying, to have the physicians, the epidemiologists, the economists, and get together in the room and reach a consensus about what is the best for the society, and then go ahead and implement it. That system where an enlightened few decide what happens to the many has other disadvantages.
I am well aware of it. That is one of my own very particular concerns, right back there.
There you go. I mean, and that system would be free of your criticism of, trying to score political points, because these are the technocrats. They don't care about political points. They're just, in a sense, they are telling the people what is best for the people.
Well, unless they've been co-opted, which is by a political side.
So just to complete the thought, and I understand where you're coming from. So I think we made the decision as a society that another way to proceed, and that's what democracy does, is to say, through our representatives, it's the people who are going to choose what's best for the people, not the technocrats or the few who are more enlightened and perhaps more educated and maybe even more qualified to make those decisions. So it's our representatives that are making these choices. So the role of technocrats is like the physicians and the epidemiologists and the economists and others, is to make sure that the decision makers, our politicians, have all the information that they need to make the right decisions. Now, of course, as you said, again, in a democracy, politicians have a diverse set of objectives, their own popularity, the scoring political points, and so on. So I don't think I will be able to solve that problem for you tonight. I don't think. So that is a bit of an issue. And living in a democracy, I think really the thing that we have to make sure is that the populace is educated enough to understand the issues, to elect the right representatives that will listen to the specialists and will make the right decisions. That's the thing we can hope for. Now, a little bit, being a little less ambitious, to talk about the restaurant example, and that's why I use the UK example. And let me say a little bit about that again. So, what emerged in the UK is the, and I'm using, it's a little bit of a caricature that I'm drawing of what happened there, but not by much. So what happened there is at some point that really this concern about shutting down the restaurants, that really became a major concern. So what the politicians, what the Treasury did, is they actually subsidized people to go full force to the restaurants. The restaurants were filled up. That proved to be a wrong solution. A lot of people got sick. A lot of people died as a result. And perhaps equally badly, this led to prolonged further lockdowns down the road. So that wasn't a way to go. Closing down the restaurants to avoid, so forbidding people to go to restaurants or just sitting outside and so on, just to avoid contagion. That led to many restaurant closures and a lot of people really who in the restaurant business who couldn't make ends meet. That's another issue, right? So what the economists prescribed is something that actually makes a lot of sense, but it uses a tax. It says, tax the people who go to restaurants, make restaurant meals more expensive, not cheaper. So as fewer people go to restaurants, then you can seat them further apart. It can be a safer environment. You don't have these crowds building up. Of course, you don't have enough sales, enough meals for the restaurants to stay alive, stay in business. So what you should do is actually take those tax revenues and give them to the restaurant owners so that they're kept in business. So that is a viable solution. It satisfies the epidemiologist's concern because it keeps the distance in the restaurants. It satisfies the economics concerns because there is a revenue for the restaurant owners. It doesn't come from the meals themselves. It comes from, because the numbers are not there. It comes from some tax revenue. It involves this dirty 3-letter word, tax. And no politician, exactly as you said, wants to be the one who taxes people during a pandemic. Can you imagine that? If you are in the other party, they're going to say, look what Mr. X is doing. He's taxing people during a pandemic. Can you imagine anything worse than that? It turns out that's the right solution. No politician wants to do it. So for the restaurant example, and there are in other aspects of the economy as well, there are ways, there are policies that take into consideration what economists call the optimal trade-off between avoiding disease transmission and not killing the economy. But these are politically costly solutions. People don't want to do it. Another thing you might have heard related, but not to pandemics, but to climate change, there's this issue of a carbon tax. And actually, Secretary Baker has advocated, together with a group of economists and politicians from across the political spectrum. They have advocated, they call it a carbon dividend, not a carbon tax, because dividend sounds better than tax. But what it is a tax on carbon emissions that evens the field and lets technologies, the renewable technologies and fossil fuel technologies, after they pay for the externality they create, to compete on an equal footing. But again, this is something that we've seen in very few states. There are some states in the Northeast, California, Canada is doing something, European countries. It's really hard politically to implement taxes.
But surcharges are perhaps better.
Yep. Secretary Baker's plan calls them dividends. So surcharge, but yeah, absolutely. So this is a problem, if I may say this, it's almost like a problem with democracy, right? That at the same time, the politician needs to be reelected. So he has that is very highly in his list or her list of priorities, and started taxing people, even if that's the right thing, won't get you reelected. So that's we are facing some of this issue when it comes to the pandemic prevention. Well, and mitigation as well.
Yeah, you have a similar problem with natural hazards. Like if you're in an earthquake-prone zone and you've just had the magnitude 7, there won't be another one for another 100 years. Then let's not worry about it for 80 years. And 10 years from now, this pandemic will be in the back of everyone's mind. And who wants to spend, I've forgotten the number that you had in your little red box, but.
Yep. So
that on pandemic prevention.
I got you, and this is actually a very important point. With earthquakes, it might be a little different. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because a big earthquake reduces tension and maybe it makes it less likely for another one to occur very soon after. Please forgive me if this is way off. But with pandemics, and this is an important point, this is not the case. These are independent events. So if we are thinking that because COVID happened now, for the next 20 years we're covered and nothing is going to happen, there is absolutely no mechanism. These are independent events. The probability that a pandemic occurs and emerges next year is independent of whether COVID happened this year or not. And that would be the worst, actually, because can you imagine as the economy begins recovering and as we're already not out of the woods, something else as big or maybe even bigger hits, that would be absolutely devastating. So that's
you're right.
Important thing to realize, that this idea that, you know, because we're having COVID now, we shouldn't be worried for a number of years after that. There's absolutely no basis to that. The next virus is in the back right now.
How do you overcome the essential potential energy barrier to get people to keep improbable events in mind? But you're actually right about earthquakes. They have a recurrence interval. So, but maybe a better example is hurricanes, because it seems now that we're getting hit, you know, kind of randomly, but more frequently by hurricanes.
That's right. And climate change is obviously, it's, you know, there's no smoking gun. But climate change might have an important role in playing in both frequency and severity.
Let's see, there's a question in the comments in the chat.
If I can, sorry.
It's Nicola. Can you actually come and voice it? Oh, Nicola's audio and video are not working. Nicholas says, it seems that most of the pandemic prevention cost relates to the ending of wild meat and wildlife trade. Do you think it's feasible to significantly reduce this trade? What incentives do you think would drive demand away from folks eating exotic wildlife?
Yeah, this is an excellent point, and this has been both deforestation, which is another important factor, but certainly wildlife trade. And you're right, this is the dominant cost in the calculations we've made so far. Both of these have been big challenges. When it comes to deforestation, it's a little easier to see how one could provide incentives. There's lost, you know, if we prevent deforestation, there is lost income to mainly agriculture, because when forests are destroyed, agriculture steps in. So if we could provide that income through alternative sources, that is somehow could play a role, could get us some ways towards avoiding deforestation. With wildlife trade, it's different. It's many times it's associated with beliefs, very important beliefs about certain medicines, natural medicines. Some of them people associate with curing impotence or curing cancer and so on. Some of them involve actually endangered species, including some wonderful species of tigers, for example. People think that their bones or certain organs have properties that they really don't have. And really, other than educating people, it's really hard. At the same time, we need to be respectful of traditions. And you know, some of this wildlife trade is associated with meat, bush meat, that people you know, value for historical, traditional reasons, and we need to be respectful of that. So that has been somewhat of a challenge. Now, where I think that we could have some gains, I'm not sure, I wouldn't call it easy gains, but perhaps it's a little easier, is when it comes to the demand coming mainly from the West, from fur, for fur and for animals related to fur and for exotic pets. And actually the United States and Europe are major importers in this exotic pet trade. So this is another dimension where I think we could have some more easy gains. But you're right, and you know, if China does this for a while, when something like that emerges, they might step in and make things really harsh and, make it illegal for a little bit of time and so on. And what you need to avoid in these cases is that if people want to do it, if people believe in it, if it's at the level of really some strong traditions and things that people believe will save their lives and so on, they'll find a way to do it, and they'll do it underground. So that's another thing that you want to avoid. At least now there is a little bit of control on what goes on in these markets. If they go fully underground and they become fully legal, it will be next to impossible to control them. So it's a fine line, and it's something that I think will remain a challenge, unfortunately, for a long time.
Wow. Yeah. So, Ted, you've been so generous. These are excellent questions that made me think about things I haven't thought about, and I'd love to see that there was some interest in this. So thank you very much. This was terrific. Yeah, there's a lot of interest, and I think people can keep going. This is like we're just experimenting right now. This is the unofficial and informal part. The meeting is officially over, so I think people can just stay in the room forever. But I would feel terrible to keep you here.
Thank you. One thing I would say, Sonia, is that if anybody, is it possible for you to make my my email address available to everyone? So if they want to get in touch, I can put it on the chat. How about that?
Yes, absolutely.
I can do,
super
so I
generous
put, so
send your questions by email. It's a poignant email address. Yeah.
It's an easy address to remember, like my first name, tedT@rice.edu. And I'm happy if I don't know the answer, I can, which is very possible. I'll try to find out and get back to you. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. And again, Sonia, this was an honor. It was, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really had a lot of fun. I wish I could see everybody live, but this, Zoom is, we live our lives through Zoom these days.
We do, and we appreciate the great opportunities it brings, as well as the challenges, obviously. So thank you, Ted. And anybody that wants to, this is the social moment. It's the salon. So here,
okay,
you guys have conversation. Anybody that wants to leave.
One thing I want to apologize. I don't know if you hear I have a 13-year-old dog, and he's sitting next to me and he's snoring. So he's not very interested in what
Washington, and he's my boyfriend.
Exactly, my miniature schnauzer. It's a German dog. So I apologize if you hear his snoring. I don't know if it makes it through the sound system, but I'm sorry about that.
Not here.
Not here.
We're muted, I think.
I unmuted it.
You're not muted.
I
want to see Bassington.
In that case.
Oh, that's so cute. That's so cute.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was indeed an honor. I really appreciate it. And it was nice meeting you all, if only virtually. Hopefully in the future, we'll do it in person.
We're going to definitely have to have you back when things are better.
Thank you very much. I see Houston. Hi, Houston.
Yeah, dinner party at our house when this is all over.
Good to see you. Take care and stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Ted.
Bye. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
That was good.
That was good, right?
Yeah, that was real good.
It was truly, Sonia, that was more than good. And that really does show what the value of Zoom itself is, because it does allow you to actually get into conversations you would never get into at the regular meetings.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's just a different scenario, and I think we're slowly getting used to it and understanding what it entails and what opportunities we have, really. So, and Alan is eating on camera.
I'm sure everyone thinks this is incredibly rude of me.
No,
Not at all.
I specifically asked you to encourage people. I'm actually so hungry, but I'm upstairs and the food is downstairs, and I was scared to carry my computer through the,
The food-
areas that have bad connectivity.
Yeah.
So yeah, really great. Is Wayne still here?
I don't think so. He didn't show up earlier when you asked him.
Our epidemiologist. I wish we had heard from him a little bit.
We'll get him next time.
When Ted was talking about the biggest problem being to get people to take vaccines that don't want to take them, it reminded me of, we've had many months of politicians trying to scare people away from the vaccines because anything under the Trump administration wouldn't be scientific and would have just been hurried in order to meet political goals. And so a lot of scaring was done that now has to be undone. And I'm glad to see that politicians of both parties are working hard and finally to try to get people to take these things.
Yeah, isn't it nice to be together?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read something the other day that I thought was very interesting. It was about trying to give vaccines to a population that has all ages. And I hadn't thought about this, but like when they gave us the polio vaccine, they just had all the kids corralled in the schools.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where you got the vaccination. But there's nothing like that unless they induct us all into the army or something, that they can vaccinate everybody at once.
Well, I was a kid back then. I was born in 1940. I don't remember whether I had a choice or my parents had a choice or not about getting that vaccine, but I was certainly glad to get it.
Yeah, I think the first one I went to the doctor for, and then when they developed the second one, they did it in the schools, and everybody just came through and got a sugar cube or 2 sugar cubes or something.
Yes.
Yep.
Boy, it made a huge difference.
Well,
Polio affected kids especially, and COVID's affecting all ages.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a hospital. Don't have. I'm a physician, and there's a hospital in Texas Medical Center to get the health workers vaccinated. They are paying money. If you get a vaccine, you get a bonus.
An incentive.
The incentive.
Yeah.
There's been a priority given to people like me that are over a certain age, which is great. I'm glad to get the vaccine. I've already had 1 shot. But I wonder, yes, old people are at the greatest risk, but I also wonder about the immune response. If the purpose of the vaccine is to produce an immune response, the older you are, the less your immune system is working. And presumably, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but it would seem to me that your immune system would be weaker as you are older, and you would get less of a desired, kick in the butt of the immune system from the vaccine. And therefore, I wonder if the vaccine is as effective in old people as that the same vaccine would have been in somebody much younger.
Speak, Wayne.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Well, the question was whether a vaccine in an elderly person is as effective, should be as effective as a vaccine in a younger person, given that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is that the purpose of the vaccine is to produce in the body an immune response more powerful than and similar to the response that the immune system has or should have to an actual COVID infection. And
well, it's never going to be as strong in the elderly because immune parameters fall off with age. The Moderna trials show that they target theirs and claim that the elderly do well with their vaccine I don't know the equivalent for the Pfizer. One of the concerns is the production and that the AstraZeneca Johnson Johnson coming out this spring will be able to produce in large quantities and make it more feasible for larger groups to receive the vaccine. And the production for the two that are out now is certainly limited. And at the number getting it every day, we'll never achieve herd immunity even by middle of the spring. So the other vaccines, which are only about 75% effective, may, because they can be given to everybody, be resulting in herd immunity more quickly than the current ones.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, there are many things that affect immunity, including the presence of other diseases. Immunity is not as good in diabetics, it's not as good in people with other immunosuppressive conditions, and in all parameters, people who are aged are not going to respond to the vaccines as well. But the Moderna trials claim that they, in their initial studies, in the phase 1 and 2 studies, the elderly did well. And they in particular claim that that's the case. So that might be a concern for getting the Moderna. I think the concern with the Pfizer always has been the cold chain. I got the Pfizer, and I got it at Ben Taub, where the pharmacy set up a reconstitution room next to the room where the vaccines were given. And I had side effects, which meant I had the actual substance. So it was handled very beautifully. But that is a concern, that the cold chain can't be broken. Once you've reconstituted, you have about 6 hours to give it before it goes bad.
Wow. Well, if anybody hears of any doses that go to waste, I volunteer.
Well, that's the thing. You try to give as much as you can, but it has to be done in an organized fashion, because if you want it to be done properly, you have to give it at the time you get you have to tell them when to get the second dose, and that's organized currently by the two companies, and you're given a card and told to come back this date at this time. And the attempts by politicians on both sides to say, well, you could give half the dose or give just one dose are probably not valid, because the studies are done with the 2 doses at this required regimen.
Yeah. Hey, Wayne, are you aware of any plans to change I guess you would almost call it the portfolio of vaccines as they're given? Because, for example, as you pointed out, the first vaccines out require more refrigeration, to a lower temperature. AstraZeneca, for example, is much, easier to take care of with normal refrigeration. So I guess the question is, do you think that over time they're going to shift to these other types of vaccines? And the reason I ask is I'm like last in line to get the shot because of, the group A, B, and all that stuff. So does that determine which shot I get?
No, the Moderna doesn't have quite the cold chain requirement that the Pfizer has. And the older vaccines involve an adenovirus, which is the old method of developing vaccines. When the adenoviruses were used for vectors with the HIV trials, the people that had the adeno antibodies had a more likely chance of developing HIV, which was never well explained. So there are some problems with the adenovector viruses, and so that makes one a little bit hesitant about them, but they can be produced in much greater quantities, and they'll probably become a standard in the future. Their efficacy isn't fully established. The preliminary data from Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca is about 75%, which, it's 95 plus for the Moderna and the Pfizer. And Moderna and Pfizer are using a messenger RNA technology is a completely new system, something that has not been used for any other vaccines before. And because it doesn't involve live or inactivated viruses, there's just little chance of any kind of reversion or development of the virus within the patients who are vaccinated. Whether any of the vaccines prevent dissemination to other individuals is not well known at all. That needs to be done, and those studies will be carried out. You can still carry the virus if you have the vaccine, and you can still transmit it to others. But whether the presence of the vaccine lowers that, we'll find out in the next few months.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shall we all go to bed or eat or something?
Yeah, this is an evolving area. I do a textbook chapter once a month, and if you're interested, I can send you a copy of that.
Yeah, and we are actually
it's cmdt.com. You can look it up, and it's the internal medicine textbook, and we do updates. Ava Clark at Baylor and I do it alternatingly every 2 weeks.
Send me that in an email. Evie, Alan, and David are installing a lunch conversation series.
Okay.
That we gonna announce, within the next few weeks or something. So you should be part of that. I'll be fine.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else?
I want to hear you sing Winterreise again.
Yeah, we should do that. It's just so hard on Zoom and singing. I have a singer's mask, and I've sung into that mask, and I've been recorded and all, but
What is a singer's mask?
It's just one that has a little bit of a frame, so you can inhale and it doesn't suck up your face, and you can actually get some oxygen. Yeah, you look like a duck.
When I play the organ in church, I have to take off my mask because it steams up my glasses.
There's that. So it's interesting. I'd love to do Winterreise.
Yeah.
We'll do it. We'll do it again.
The camera did a rehash of theirs from about 3 years ago on their Schubert's Winter Travel song.
Okay.
Beautiful work.
Wonderful song cycle, 24 songs.
And a little bit morose.
A Winter's Journey.
A Winter's Journey, yeah. A jilted lover.
It's really it's been written for baritone, but Tali, whom you met earlier, and I did it a few years ago, and then Wayne and I did a few excerpts over a dinner party at his house, and some actually at the
And some at the Houston Philosophical Society at the antechamber there. Yeah.
We'll do more of that. All right, people, have a wonderful night. It's been delightful and inspiring and stimulating for sure. I just love this kind of salon hangout. So we'll continue with that. Evie and David and Alan will be in touch tomorrow about our lunch series.
Maybe an early evening series. I didn't realize that's what you were talking about when you communicated with me. So if we've all agreed on lunch, that's fine. If it turns out that early evening cocktail hour is better, that's fine too.
Yeah, well, we'll talk. Let's just discuss tomorrow. For me, that's always hard with kids. And service. All right, but not everybody is in that position.
True.
We'll be in touch tomorrow. Okay, love you guys.
Thank you.
Spectacular evening. Thank you.
Super. Really good.
Hey, fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.